Well, I'm pleased to be here tonight to share with you this program about a train that you know because of a song written in the early 1970s. But first, okay, now the Irfan view's not working. It won't advance. Oh, there we go.
Okay, there.
Okay. But first, a little background about my connection with this song. I grew up in Mattoon, Illinois, a city of about 20,000 people in east central Illinois, located nearly 200 miles south of Chicago and 45 miles south of Champaign. And I always know when someone is not from Illinois when they mispronounce the name of my hometown, as Paul did a few minutes ago. But I've heard that a lot. Mattoon had two railroads, one of which was the Chicago to New Orleans main line of the Illinois Central. And when I was growing up, it was common for school children and other groups of children to go to the IC station in Mattoon to take a short train ride. And more often than not, the train that we rode was the southbound City of New Orleans, which was scheduled into Mattoon around between 10:30 and 11 a.m. We would ride 27 miles to Effingham, where either a school bus or a carpool was waiting to bring us back home. I did this twice, and they would give you this button that I still have. My house was on the south edge of town, and I had a view of the icy tracks across farm fields, even if it was a distant view. Particularly during the summer, I often saw IC train number 1 head south late morning. At night, we would sit in the backyard listening to a baseball game on the radio, and just before 9 p.m., IC number 2 would come rushing into town. IC passenger locomotives had Mars lights, and we could see that moving over the horizon before we'd even see the train. Given this background, I took more than a passing interest in a song I began hearing on the radio in late 1972 about a train with the disappearing railroad blues. That song was City of New Orleans. You probably know it was written by Steve Goodman, recorded by Arlo Guthrie, and later recorded by Willie Nelson, whose rendition of the song won a Grammy Award. You probably also have heard the story of how Goodman rode the city, took notes of what he observed, and used those observations to write the song. It is the story that Goodman himself told many times during his life. It was accurate but far from complete. It is one of the many myths, mysteries, and half-truths that surround the song, including the erroneous belief of many that it was written by Arlo Guthrie. Tonight, I'm going to share with you a more comprehensive story of the song based on research that I conducted in 2014 that I later used to write an article for Trains magazine. My original thought was that the article would be published in the April 2015 issue to mark the 45th anniversary of the fateful trip that Steve Goodman took aboard Illinois Central Train number 1, but it didn't work out that way. The story was held for 2 years before being published in an issue devoted to trains and music that came out in 2017. Long before there was a song, there was a train named City of New Orleans that ran between Chicago and its namesake city. The City of New Orleans was part of a class of post-World War II streamliners that the railroads hoped would help them hold on to much of the passenger traffic that they had served during the war. It was intended to be the premier coach train on the IC Chicago-New Orleans route and replace the Creole. The equipment to be used for the train toured the IC system before it went into service. You can see these articles about it that were out of a Memphis newspaper. IC numbers 1 and 2 entered revenue service on April 27, 1947, and is shown in an early era photo made by Otto Perry at Effingham, Illinois. At the time, it had a slightly faster schedule than the all-Pullman Panama Limited, making 19 intermediate stops en route. The city of New Orleans immediately became one of the IC's premier trains and often received equal billing with the Panama Limited. Although the city of New Orleans had equipment similar to that of the Panama Limited, the two trains served two distinctive markets. In the city's early years, the IC sought to tap some of the same market that patronized the Panama Limited, but with limited success. The city's schedule was not conducive for day trips to Chicago or to New Orleans. Much of the ridership was people traveling between Chicago and Memphis and to points in Mississippi. Unlike most railroads, the Illinois Central enjoyed a thriving passenger business well into the 1960s because of the lack of highway competition along the Chicago-New Orleans route. The development of three major state universities along the route in Illinois also helped feed that business, and the high quality of service played a role as well. IC President Wayne Johnston was an unabashed fan of passenger service, and during his tenure, few passenger trains, were discontinued. This is what the IC passenger schedule looked like in 1966. Not a single IC long-distance train had been discontinued. In fact, the number of trains between Chicago and Carbondale, Illinois, was the same as it had been since the early 1950s. Now, all of that began to change after William B. Johnson became president that year in 1966. The IC cut service south of Carbondale, with some long-distance trains now operating only between Chicago and Carbondale, or in the case of the Louisiana, between Chicago and Memphis. The former Louisiana, later named the Mid-American, is shown here leaving Memphis. It was rescheduled in an effort to take some of the business of the city of New Orleans, which still operated with extra sections, into the late 1960s during peak travel periods. The IC achieved some level of national acclaim during the late 1960s with its development of the mini corridor between Chicago and Carbondale. Those efforts were led by Paul Reistrup, who is shown here in an advertisement promoting the aura of the IC being a passenger-friendly railroad. The reality was different, which would give rise to a song about the disappearing railroad blues. City of New Orleans may have been popularized by Arlo Guthrie, but was written by Steve Goodman. Although Goodman said in an interview that the song was inspired by an April 1970 trip aboard IC number 1, the genesis of the song had occurred a few years earlier. Stephen Benjamin Goodman was born July 25, 1948 in Chicago, a year after the train he would make famous began operating. He initially lived on Chicago's north side and attended Maine East High School in suburban Park Ridge. In the liner notes of a posthumous album of his song, Goodman's wife, the former Nancy Pruder, described him this way. Basically, Steve was exactly... Now, this is where I'm having a difficulty because I intended to read what she said, but I can't see it. I'll have to temporarily move this. Was exactly who he appeared to be. Trying to advance this. Now it seems to be stuck. Okay, oops. An ambitious, well-adjusted man from a loving, middle-class Jewish home in the Chicago suburbs, whose life and talent were directed by the physical pain and time constraints of a fatal disease, which he kept at bay, at times seemingly by willpower alone. Steve wanted to live as normal a life as possible, only he had to live it. And I'm having all kinds of difficulties with this. As fast as he could. He extracted meaning from, this is really annoying to have this blocking my view. He
Um,
extracted meaning from the mundane.
let me suggest if you, Craig, if you like,
Yeah.
are you seeing my face? Are you cursed to see my face on your screen? And
Okay.
if
Say
you
that
hold
again.
your, yeah, can you see me on your screen? Is that what's part of the
Yes, I see
blocking?
you.
Yeah, if you put your mouse over my picture
Yes.
at the up above it, either right above it or above somebody
Yes.
else's picture, do you
It
see
says
like four
chat and
boxes at the
pin.
top, like a little underscore, a half block, like an equal sign, and then a Hollywood Squares thing?
Uh, yeah. The
Click on the
Hollywood.
little blue one to the left, the blue underscore there, the little blue line. Click on that, and that might make that window smaller.
Okay, but it hasn't made the controls go away.
Oh, okay. Huh.
Well,
That's a
anyway,
little
we'll
that's a little
press
tougher
on
to,
here.
yeah.
What is happening is when I try to move that out of the way so I can read it, then I go back to
Yeah,
Earthen view and it
yeah.
wants to go backwards and not
Hmm.
forwards.
Hmm. Okay.
And I've got some more screens like this, so well,
Okay.
okay.
Would it
Talk.
help if I read the quotes when you got to quotes?
Yes.
Okay, I'll do that.
Let's do that.
Okay.
All right. After graduating from high school in 1965, Goodman began attending the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. Like many UI students from Chicago, Goodman traveled to and from school aboard Illinois Central trains, which gave him some familiarity with the railroad's service. Generations of college students came to the doors of the Champaign station, which is not far from the UI campus. But Goodman often would stay on board the train past Champaign and get off in Carbondale. There he would visit friends at Southern Illinois University. Later in the day, he would board another IC train and head back to Champaign. In 1967, Goodman remained on board the City of New Orleans all the way to New Orleans. IC number 1 was scheduled to arrive in the Crescent City around 1 a.m. and depart later that morning for Chicago at 7 a.m. After boarding IC number 2, Goodman fell asleep, and when he woke up, the experience he had made a lasting impression. Um, as told in the book Steve Goodman, Facing the Music, a high school friend, Howard Primer, described that experience this way. And when he woke up, it was like he was in a surreal world. The sound of the train, the rhythm of the train, the swaying of the train. Looking out the windows at the misty morning on the Delta country. And he was talking about Good Morning America. Goodman would eventually return to Chicago, and he and Primer wrote a few lyrics on a napkin, creating the second line of the chorus. Don't you know me? I'm your native son. Goodman later retooled the first line of the chorus to Good Morning America, how are you? The pair also came up with the opening line, Riding on the City of New Orleans. But Goodman's first serious attempt at songwriting was far from complete. The song still needed fleshing out, yet he had settled on telling the narrative from the train's point of view. Later that year, Goodman dropped out of the University of Illinois and began devoting his time to songwriting and singing. He made money by singing jingles for soap, facial creams, and other products. He developed a small following at a Chicago nightclub known as the Earl of Old Town. It was there in September 1969 that he met Nancy Pruder, who was working as a waitress. They married in February 1970. During this time, he also learned why he often felt fatigued. He had leukemia, which must have felt like a death sentence. This not only influenced his songwriting, but would play a major role in the fate of City of New Orleans, even though the song had yet to come together. 2 months after his marriage, Steve and Nancy Goodman went to Chicago Central Station on a cold Monday morning in April 1970, where they plunked down $22 for 2 round-trip tickets to Mattoon, Illinois. The purpose of the trip was to visit Nancy's 90-year-old grandmother who lived in the Illinois Masonic home outside Sullivan, Illinois, which is located northwest of Mattoon. Goodman carried with him aboard the train a Martin D28 acoustic guitar. It had been about 3 years since he had ridden the city and made a stab at writing a song about the train. In the intervening years, the railroad industry had accelerated the pace of discontinuing intercity passenger trains, and the Illinois Central was no longer an exception to the trend. This was the schedule in use at the time the Goodmans bought their tickets. The schedule shows just how much service had changed since Goodman used to ride to and from college. The Chicago, Florida Seminole had become the Chicago Carbondale Shawnee. The northbound Creole and southbound Southern Express between Chicago and New Orleans were now the Chicago Carbondale Illini. A note in the timetable indicated the IC was going through the regulatory process to discontinue the Mid-American. The IC also wanted to end the Hawkeye, its last passenger trains serving Iowa, the last trains serving St. Louis, a section of the Panama Limited, and the last trains between Chicago and Springfield, Illinois, the Governor's Special, formerly the Chicago-St. Louis Green Diamond. It is not clear how much of this history Goodman knew. He had a fondness for passenger trains, but was a musician and not a passenger train advocate. He might have heard from crew members or others how the IC was removing trains and whittling service, or he might have sensed something he had not sensed before. The Goodmans boarded train number 1, the southbound City of New Orleans, which left Central Station at 8 a.m. for its 921-mile jaunt to New Orleans. The schedule was not quite as fast as it had been in the late 1940s or early 1950s, but it was still one of America's fastest trains, and between Champaign and Mattoon, a distance of 44.6 miles, the city made the trip in 33 minutes for an average speed of 81.1 miles per hour, one of the fastest scheduled passenger runs in the country. They settled into their seats, which would have looked like this preserved IC coach at the Monticello Railroad Museum. Had they been inclined to go to the dining car, this would have been the menu they would have seen. But Goodman instead began watching out the window. To quote Goodman from an interview that he gave, Nancy was sleeping in the seat next to me. I just took out a sketch pad and I looked out the window and wrote down everything I saw. Junkyards, little towns that didn't even have a sign to say what they were. But Goodman instead began watching out the window and he saw houses, he saw farms, he saw fields. Incidentally, all three of what you just saw I took from a train on the Illinois Central line, although an Amtrak train. Just out of Chicago, continuing with that interview, there was a bunch of old men standing around, tin cans, warming themselves and waving. Nancy was still asleep after about an hour and a half, so I went down to the club car and ended up playing cards with a couple of old men. This is a publicity photo from the Illinois Central that shows what an IC lounge car looked like at that time. 3 hours and 171 miles later, the train halted in Mattoon. The Goodmans would have walked up these stairs to street level. I've often wondered what was going through Goodman's mind as he climbed these stairs. He might have been thinking about how they were going to get to Sullivan, or he might have been thinking about how to incorporate what he had just seen into the song he started writing 3 years earlier. Donald Steffi, who compiled an annual train speed report for Trains magazine, wrote in June 1969 that the city of New Orleans was one of America's best patronized trains. The IC was not trying to get rid of it, and if Amtrak had not come along a year later, the city might have been the IC's last long distance train. So, what was this disappearing railroad blues business all about? It probably was about trains generally. It also might have reflected the anxieties Goodman had heard or sensed during that trip. Many who rode the city of New Orleans were going to places that had little to no public transportation. Yet Interstates 57 and 55, which ran parallel to the IC main line between Chicago and New Orleans, were being finished section by section. Locomotive and air conditioning failures were becoming more frequent, and there were reports of surly trainmen, dirty cars, and late trains. Many who rode the city of New Orleans to the Deep South worried that their lifeline to what they called the old country in Memphis and small town Mississippi was about to vanish. It was not a sure thing that passenger trains were going to survive. This might have made an impression on a young man who wasn't sure he was going to survive either. Back in Chicago, Goodman went to work at revising City of New Orleans. He continued to play at the Earl of Old Town, where he began performing a song he had just finished about a dying train. A fellow musician, Richard Wedler, heard him perform City of New Orleans and suggested that he rewrite it. As Steve Goodman would later say in an interview, Wedler told him, "Why don't you talk about what happened on the train? Then you'll have it." I said, "Sure," and wrote the second verse at a desk at the back of the bar, and that was it. At long last, City New Orleans was complete. A year later, Goodman was playing as the opening act for Chris Christopherson at the Quiet Night in Chicago. Impressed with Goodman's work, Christopherson introduced Goodman to Paul Anka, who was playing at another club in town. Anka arranged for Goodman to make demonstration tapes in New York, and these recordings led to a recording contract with Buddha, which recorded Goodman's first album in Nashville. The album, titled Steve Goodman, contained the first recorded version of City of New Orleans. The record, though, did not sell well. Goodman knew he didn't have enough recognition to make City of New Orleans a commercial success. He feared that he might have only a year or less to live and was desperate to have a better-known singer record City of New Orleans. He approached some well-known singers, but they turned down the song. One singer who was interested was rising star John Denver. He first heard about the song from Arlo Guthrie, who had heard Goodman perform it in Chicago in 1971. Denver would later claim that Guthrie suggested that he, Denver, record City of New Orleans. Guthrie contends he said no such thing and that he, Guthrie, wanted to record the song and told Denver not to record it. Whatever the case, Denver met with Goodman at a New York hotel to discuss recording City of New Orleans. Denver said he didn't think City of New Orleans could be a success as written, and he wanted Goodman to approve a revision of the last verse, which you know is "Good Night America, How Are You?" Denver recorded the song, and when he did, he changed it to "Good Night America, I Love You." Denver's version of City New Orleans failed to chart, and further controversy arose when Denver gave himself a co-authorship of the song on Airy, the album on which it appeared. The tale of how Goodman and Guthrie met has been told many times with varying details, including the name of the Chicago club at which they met and who approached whom. By one account, Goodman approached Guthrie and asked to sing some songs for him. Another account has it that club owner Richard Harding approached Guthrie and suggested that he listen to Goodman play his song about a train. Guthrie was the son of folk singer and composer Woody Guthrie, who is known for composing This Land Is Your Land. The younger Guthrie had gained recognition in 1967 for his 18-minute counterculture ballad, Alice's Restaurant Massacre, and for performing in the 1969 movie Alice's Restaurant. This is the version Guthrie would later tell of how he learned about City of New Orleans, which he repeats during concerts before performing the song. This kid comes up to me and says, "Mr. Guthrie, I know you're tired, but I have some songs I think you'll really like, and I'd like to play them for you." He was right. I was tired. But he seemed sincere, so I said, "Kid, here's what's going to happen. You're going to buy me a beer, and as long as I'm sitting here drinking that beer, I'll listen to what you have to play." Friends, that was one of the longest, most enjoyable beers I ever had. Um, Guthrie would record City of New Orleans in 1972, well after the John Denver version had been recorded and released. The recording was done at the Amigo Studios in North Hollywood, California. Producing the album would be Larry Waronker, who had produced Guthrie's album Running Down the Road, which had spawned the minor hit Coming into Los Angeles, a drug joke tune. It was Waronker who was instrumental in giving City of New Orleans the ballad-like feel that you all know. Guthrie had been performing City of New Orleans in concert, but as a rock song, not a ballad or folk song. At the time, Guthrie was seeking to be taken more seriously as a performer, as well as to distinguish himself from his father's folk music. Waronker had been told about Guthrie's intention to record City of New Orleans, and Guthrie had invited him to hear him play it in a concert in San Jose, California. Waronker would later say in an interview about that concert, "I didn't realize it was a song that they were talking about till they were halfway through it, but you could easily recognize it as a very unique and beautiful song. It was almost like watching a movie. It was so cinematic. The three verses were a play in three acts united by the soaring chorus." Co-producer John Pilla agreed with Waronker, but Guthrie resisted their efforts to persuade him to record City of New Orleans as a pop version of a Johnny Cash approach. Guthrie didn't want the song to have the same folksy feel as Goodman's own version because folk music was what Guthrie was trying to get away from. They had many debates about it, but Waronker saw an opening one night when he brought in some studio musicians who could give the song the sound he and Pilla had envisioned. It was a simple and more laid-back pace that Guthrie agreed to go with, but due to the lateness of the hour, no one noticed that the tempo was depressingly slow. Engineer Don Landy used recording studio wizardry to speed it up. Instead of strings, Waronker had a musician play the accordion for the background music, using a reedy register for the verses and a fuller, more mournful sound on the choruses, which featured the voices of two female background singers that were triple-tracked. Guthrie's voice was double-tracked. Waronker would later say that we wanted an angelic sound but not too much church. So we told them to back off on the vibrato, and we built up at least 3 tracks of background vocals, plus Arlo's vocals, and they really took the chorus to another place. Now, Guthrie made a few changes to the lyrics, whereas Goodman had written Passing Towns That Have No Name, Guthrie sang Passing Trains That Have No Name. Whereas Goodman had written and the rhythm of the rails is all they dream, Guthrie sang, and the rhythm of the rails is all they feel. City New Orleans was released on Guthrie's Hobo's Lullaby album, and the single was released in spring of 1972 without a promotional campaign. It was picked up by some southern radio stations and its popularity spread. That summer it broke into the top 20, receiving heavy airplay on AM and FM stations. And what did Steve Goodman think about the Guthrie version? Well, he said this once in an interview. Arlo slowed it down a bit, changed one of the chords, and read the words so good that I learned the song. Goodman and Guthrie would become friends and on occasion would perform together on stage. Willie Nelson would later record City of New Orleans, releasing it in August 1984. Nelson's version hit #1 on the country charts and earned a Grammy Award in 1985. The song has been recorded more than 150 times by scores of musicians including Johnny Cash, Judy Collins, Jimmy Buffett, and Chet Atkins. It has now been 49 years since Arlo Guthrie released City New Orleans. Many people, particularly those with a passion for railroads, have described it as one of the best railroad songs of all time. Goodman biographer Clay Eels wrote that City New Orleans became a long-lasting hit, partly because of its sweet and catchy tune, but also because its wistful lyrics connected a declining railroad industry with a generation of young, seemingly forsaken native songs. Steve Goodman ended up living much longer than he might have thought he would, but succumbed to leukemia on September 24, 1984, at age 36 in Seattle. By then he had moved from Chicago to the West Coast, where he continued to perform virtually until his death. City of New Orleans would be his most successful song, even though that success was attained through the recordings of other performers. In Chicago, many today are more familiar with another of Goodman's songs, Go Cubs Go, which is played and sung at Wrigley Field at the end of every Cubs victory. Goodman's record sold only a modest number of copies but received much critical acclaim. He developed a small but loyal following, and his legacy today is known for his songwriting and stage presence during concerts. When he died, a Boston radio station played 18 consecutive hours of his music. As for Arlo Guthrie, City of New Orleans would be his only chart success. He continues to perform the song in concerts, and he once rode Amtrak City of New Orleans as part of a fundraiser following Hurricane Katrina. City of New Orleans made Guthrie, in the eyes of some, the train song guy, and he once said, "I get letters from railroad guys all over the country who hear that song and start crying." As for the train they called the City of New Orleans, the Illinois Central continued to operate it until the coming of Amtrak. This is IC's last schedule before Amtrak. Numbers 1 and 2 were among just 4 Chicago-New Orleans trains left. The city would have been the only train between Chicago and New Orleans had the IC been successful in discontinuing the Panama Limited in October 1970. The creation of the National Railroad Passenger Corporation ended the disappearing railroad blues on the main line of Mid-America. Yet Amtrak kept just 2 pairs of trains. In Amtrak's first timetable, shown here, service on the IC was cut to 2 pairs of trains, the City of New Orleans and the Chicago-Carbondale-Shawnee. The inside of Amtrak's first timetable shows how much the service had been cut. For several more weeks, the train continued to have an IC identity with IC equipment and employees, but by summer, passenger cars from other railroads were being assigned to the Amtrak trains on the IC. When Amtrak acquired its own equipment in late 1971, it bought few IC cars and leased or bought a handful of IC passenger locomotives. Amtrak retired the City of New Orleans name on November 14, 1971, when it switched its Chicago-New Orleans train to overnight operation and brought back the Panama Limited name. Amtrak continued to use Chicago Central Station until March 6, 1972, when the trains using it shifted to Union Station. By 1973, equipment still wearing Illinois Central colors and markings had become scarce, limited to a few locomotives, some of them leased and still carrying their IC roster numbers. It wasn't long before the Amtrak identity was complete. As you can see here, the Panama Limited is shown in Homewood in the mid-1970s. The Panama Limited was a troubled train, often running well behind schedule due to poor track conditions. I think I got ahead of myself here, or I'm missing something. Oh, all right. Was a troubled train, often running well behind schedule due to poor track conditions and equipment breakdowns. In an effort to give the train a new image, Amtrak restored the City of New Orleans name on February 1st, 1981, and issued this brochure to promote that. The Illinois Central merged with the Gulf Mobile in Ohio on August 10, 1972, to become the Illinois Central Gulf. On February 29, 1988, the ICG dropped Gulf from its name and reverted to Illinois Central. It also dropped the color orange in favor of black with the new IC Death Star logo. During the presidency of Edward Moyers, the IC reduced its main line from double to single track with frequent passing sidings. The automatic train stop system long used between Champaign and Branch Junction north of Centralia was removed. Canadian National purchased the IC on February 11, 1998, and integrated it into CN on July 1st, 1999. For many years, though, it was known as CNIC, and the talking defect detectors continued to say IC Railroad. The train they still call the City of New Orleans evolved as well. Amtrak gave the city superliner equipment on March 3, 1994. The city was rerouted off its traditional route between Memphis and Jackson on September 10, 1995. It began using the route taken by most IC freights on the Yazoo district, which had not had passenger service since 1965, and one segment had been freight only since 1941. With funding from the state of Illinois, the Chicago-Carbondale corridor has some semblance of the service frequency it had in the final years when the IC operated its own trains. Although I should hasten to add this was true until last March, when two of these trains were suspended during the early days of the pandemic. Traces of the original Illinois Central are becoming difficult to find. Chicago Central Station was razed in 1974, and the site is now a housing development. This is the restored IC station in Kankakee, Illinois, which still carries some vestiges of its previous owner. Former Illinois Central locomotives and their Death Star livery can still be found on the IC. And in recent years, amazingly, the number of Illinois Central locomotives still saying Illinois Central has actually increased on the Chicago-New Orleans main line. This photo was taken about a year ago in Posodum, Illinois. The Monticello Railroad Museum has saved several IC passenger cars that it can put together on occasion to create an IC train. It is working on painting an E unit into IC passenger colors. Ed Ellis, seen at far right, grew up along Oh, I'm sorry, I got ahead of myself again. This is again at the Monticello Railroad Museum. Ed Ellis on the far right grew up along the Illinois Central, and his company Iowa Pacific, which is in the process of being liquidated, I understand, repainted many of its passenger cars in the IC colors. Amtrak City of New Orleans serves much the same clientele as the IC City of New Orleans. The ridership turns to turnover a great deal at Jackson, Mississippi, shown here, and at Memphis. One difference between the IC and Amtrak versions is that numbers 58 and 59 of Amtrak has more day trip business to and from Chicago, although some of that is split between the northbound Saluki, which runs 4 hours later than the northbound City, and the southbound Illini, which runs 4 hours earlier than the southbound City. The IC operated the City of New Orleans for 24 years, but as of July 2004, Amtrak has operated a train named City of New Orleans far longer. The number of passengers who would recognize and associate this menu cover with the IC City of New Orleans is shrinking. Amtrak has paid lip service to the city's heritage on occasion. It created this image and here and there has offered Creole and Southern cuisine in the dining car. But for the most part, the City of New Orleans is just another long-distance train. And yet, in the hearts of many Americans, it is not just another train. In downtown Arcola, Illinois, within sight of the former IC tracks, is this mural paying tribute to the original City of New Orleans. The artist even got right the livery that IC passenger locomotives wore when the city was introduced in 1947. And the song written by this man, Steve Goodman, continues to resonate because Americans love a story about something special that's in danger of being lost, that's still worth having, and they can relate to a celebration of the rituals of ordinary people.
Riding on the City of New Orleans, Illinois Central, Monday morning rail. 15 cars and 15 restless riders, 3 conductors, 25 sacks of mail. All along the southbound Odyssey, the train pulls out at Kankakee and rolls along past houses, farms, and fields, passing trains that have no name, and freight yards full of old black men, and the graveyards of the rusted automobiles. Good morning, America, how are you? Said, don't you know me? I'm your native son. I'm the train they call the City of New Orleans. I'll be gone 500 miles when the day is done. Dealing card games with the old man in the club car. Penny a point, ain't no one keeping score. Pass the paper bag that holds the bottle. You feel the wheels rumbling neath the floor. And the sons of Pullman porters and the sons of engineers write their fathers' magic carpets made of steel. Mothers with their babes asleep, rocking to the gentle beat, and the rhythm of the rails is all they feel. Good morning, America, how are you? Said, don't you know me? I'm your native son. I'm the train they call the city of New Orleans. I'll be gone 500 miles when the day is done. Nighttime on the city of New Orleans, changing cars in Memphis, Tennessee. Halfway home, and we'll be there by morning. Through the Mississippi darkness, rolling down to the sea. But all the towns and people seem to fade into a bad dream, and the steel rail still ain't heard the news. The conductor sings his songs again. The passengers will please refrain. This train got to disappear in railroad blues. Good night, America, how are you? Say, don't you know me? I'm your native son. I'm the train they call the city of New Orleans. I'll be gone 500 miles when the day